All right, any questions or comments or complaints about the first three chapters of Genesis? Um, there in much of this text, including what we're going to study tonight with Cain and Abel, there are a lot that we don't know, and we have to always and depending on your aptitude, I guess, for that kind of thing. That's more difficult for some than it is for others. But we just have to be content with the fact that there's just some things God hasn't revealed to us. One of the things we don't know is where the Garden of Eden was that we studied there in chapters 2 and 3. We have some hints and can get some proximity to it based upon those two of the rivers listed. We talked about how those things may have changed drastically, certainly with the flood, but just with time. But that still gives you that, it wasn't somewhere between, Minnesota and Illinois. We know that it was we know the region where it was. Uh, what happened to Adam and Eve's existence in that garden? Okay, they got kicked out. And the text, there's another thing we don't know. The text, at least at that time, makes it sound like that the garden was still there. They were just forbidden from entering it. And so we would assume that if it was still there, we could locate it. We might not be able to enter it, but we'd be able to locate it. But do we make an assumption that at some point God removed that tree of life and even that tree of the knowledge of good and evil that was there, and so that it is no longer a Garden of Eden, that it was cursed with the rest of creation? Again, some assumptions there, but we're assuming that though the text again makes it sound like it was still there. How were they prevented from just going back into it if they wanted to? Okay. The cherubim at the east end of the Garden of Eden and the flaming sword that was there. We didn't talk a whole lot about that. The idea of the cherubim, um, there's two terms used in Scripture, at least two that I'm aware of, cherubim and seraphim, that are there. Then there's another thing we don't know a whole lot about them. They're mentioned sporadically in Scripture, cherubim and seraphim. We make a jump and an assumption that they were angels. Interestingly enough, the biblical text never calls them angels. They have some similarities to angelic beings. And I'm not saying they're not angels. I'm just saying it's just never spelled out that cherubim and seraphim. We know that they are heavenly beings. They are spiritual beings, kind of in that category. We get to the book of Revelation, although there's a lot of symbolic and prophetic language there of the living creatures and the elders that are in heaven. And so they may be in that classification, may be angels as well. We're just not really sure of their classification. So we ended chapter 3 with the sin of Adam and Eve, the punishments, the curses. Remember, we went through all those curses of them. And now we began chapter 4, and we're going to see that sin continues. In fact, you could make the argument that from Genesis chapter 3 through 5, the beginning of chapter 6, that we're just seeing sin in its reality, and that is how it affects us and our relationship to God, and how it seemingly always just increasingly gets worse in that. And maybe that seems like the lesson of this. Adam and Eve sinned in chapter 3. We're going to have the sin of Cain in chapter 4. We'll talk about chapter 5 when we get there. And then by the time we get to chapter 6 and the story of the flood, that sin has just ramped up and spread and gotten so bad. And so we're just seeing, hey, sin entered the world, and look what sin does. And that seems to be maybe the lesson, the big overarching lesson from this section. Um, Another thing we don't know, we can make a long list of things we don't know, or at least make a very long list of things I don't know. But we don't know how much time transpires in these sections. Like when it says in chapter 4, verse 1, now Adam knew Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. So, how much time transpired between the creation, the sin in chapter 3, and now them bearing children in chapter 4? We have no idea. Um, could have been a short amount of time, could have been a long amount of time, couldn't it? Because starting with Adam, people are going to live a long time, 900-ish years, up until the flood. The flood seems to put a stop to that. We don't really have a good explanation. In fact, somebody asked me just recently about that. These long, that's one of the things that if you're a skeptic, you would look at and scoff and say, yeah, that proves the Bible's not real. People living to be 900, 800, and 900. But I think one of the problems we have with that is, have you ever met somebody that was 100 or 100 plus? I think we have in our mind that Adam would have been that when he was 100, and then he had to live another 800 years beyond what we conceive of somebody of 100. And we just can't even conceive of that. Even somebody getting to be 100 is odd to us, and worthy of the newspaper, and you know, uh, but somebody who is that aged and has difficulties with health and hearing and all those, and you think you got to live 800 years of that, even if you just leveled off at 100 and had to live another 800 years after that, that would be, just almost inconceivable. But having to actually age and get older after that is challenging to our mindset. Mark? Yeah. Yeah. We have some exceptions to that. And I think that's what we're seeing here is we can't ascribe our aging process to their aging process. It's been argued that they were closer in proximity to Adam and Eve, who were built to live forever. And, you know, uh, the introduction of disease and different things that have, you know, just gotten worse over time, and that they would not have been plagued. And in other words, that I don't think, again, let me get in my opinion box over here. I don't know, but I don't imagine that Adam, Methuselah, these other characters would have looked like 100-year-old person today when they got to be 100. They probably looked like that when they got to be 900. And so that aging process was different for them than it was for us. John? Yeah. Hmm. The greatest generation, yeah. 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 Yeah, yeah, that could certainly be one of the reasons. We could speculate. Again, that's all we're doing is for that. And the other is that maybe they needed longer amount of time to have more children to populate the earth at that time. So, but anyway, she bears this son, names him Cain. What does the word Cain mean? Does anybody know or have a Bible that tells you? Okay, if you're like me, you need a magnifying glass to read it. Okay. The hint is in what she said, I've gotten a man from the Lord. It means acquire or to get. And so it just means she got a son. I have gotten a man from the Lord. I'll give you a little joke here. When I was at Florida College back in the 80s, it was no secret that some of the young ladies attended Florida College, and maybe some of the young men too, to just find a spouse. And they said that this was the slogan for the ladies at Florida College, that I have gotten a man from the Lord. So a little bit out of context there, but I heard that joke. Yes, Mark.
I can't read it. It's Qayin. That's in Hebrew, I think.
Yeah, that'd be the Hebrew word. That just again just simply means I have gotten or to acquire. Uh, yeah, the man child. And then she bore again, verse 2, and called his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of ground. Again, anybody have a center column reference that tells what the word Abel means? Cain means to acquire. This was an interesting one. Abel means kind of worthless. It kind of, if we use the word, we'd say what a waste. And you kind of think, well, that's kind of a cruel thing to name your son, is worthless, especially as a baby. But we'll talk about maybe where that comes from. Adam?
It could also be translated vapor. And so breath having briefness of his life, we go all the way to the New Testament about vapor and things too.
Yeah. We make an assumption again. Get over here to my opinion box, that the word did not have that meaning when she named him, but it came to mean that because his life was a waste. Not in the sense that he was a moral reprobate and wasted his life and drinking and wild women and that kind of thing, but it was a waste that it was taken from him because it was that vapor. So yeah, we think maybe that was kind of, it came after the fact because he was the first one to have that name, and so it just kind of came from that. And a key point there, that he was a keeper of sheep, Cain was a tiller of ground. And of course, we know the story. They both bring an offering to God. God accepts Abel's offering, but rejects Cain's offering. There's the beginning of this story. And then, of course, let me get ahead here. There we go. So here we are in chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. Cain murders Abel. Then we're going to look at the family of Cain, and then the broader genealogy of the family of Abel. Why was one gift accepted and the other rejected? Again, we have to be very careful to forget what you've heard in sermons before, because we're not really told. The only hint we have is in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews. It says, by faith, Abel offered a more excellent. And so whatever he did was associated with faith. And you probably heard the connecting of the dots that preachers do, and faith comes by hearing. And so Abel must have done something that God told him to do. That's where the faith came from. I don't not sure about that. But here's some options. Option number one is that maybe God had earlier commanded what he wanted to be offered. Now we know that when the law comes into effect, but that's way down the road, that animals as well as crops, grain offerings were going to be accepted. But when we read before the law, all we ever read about is animal sacrifices. The 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 grain offerings, the vegetable, we may say crop offerings, come later as far as the record is. And so maybe we could make an assumption that God had said, I want an animal sacrifice, because that's what Noah's going to do. That's what Abraham's going to do. And so that's a possibility that Abel just obeyed God. Cain just outright disobeyed him and took of his crops. Um, Another possibility, God was in the action declaring, God was in this action declaring what he wanted. Oh, I would reject this option, that this was God now saying, that That just to me makes God capricious and cruel. Just say, bring me an offering, and you bring an offering, and he just slaps you and says, no, not that. Well, but anyway, some scholars offer that. Um, Another possibility is that Abel brought his best. Not that God cared what you brought, but he wanted the best. Abel brought a best, and Cain brought kind of like what we read in the book of Malachi later. Cain just brought just whatever, maybe the worst of his crops. Here's another possibility. I think the first and this fourth one are more legitimate. Abel's offering maybe was given in the proper frame of mind. That it wasn't the offering that was rejected, it was the way it was offered. We know that today that happens with worship. You can go do all the 5 acts of worship, just what God said, but if you're not in the right frame of mind, God would reject that. Glenn?
That was wrong.
And that's not a stretch when we learn what we learned about Cain, that he seems to have an attitude problem, doesn't he? And so it could be that is just his attitude was he didn't have that proper frame of mind, that proper attitude. Here's another possibility, maybe a stretch, that his life wasn't in accordance with God's will. Again, we know from our study of worship that if God, you go out here Monday through Saturday and just live it up a sinful life and do all you want, and then come to church on Sunday without any repentance involved, God's not going to accept your worship because you plan on going out Monday and starting all over, living that sinful life. So anyway, here's our options. Again, the text doesn't tell us. I would again maybe lean toward number 1 or number 4. Again, the attitude that Glenn talked about, or maybe that it just simply wasn't offered what God wanted them to offer. But regardless, we can we assume, I think this is a safe assumption here, that God was just in his in his condemnation of Cain, and in his acceptance of Abel. But as often is the case, Cain is now upset. In fact, this text says he's very angry. My translation says, and his countenance fell. What does your translation say there at the end of verse 5? For his countenance fell. Anything different than that? What's the countenance? What is a countenance? Yeah, that's just kind of your face, and so you can just see almost. I picture a child here just pouting with his lip out. Child don't have very good poker faces. They show their emotions, don't they? And they're just sulking and pouting. And so God comes to him and says, "Why are you angry? If you did well, verse 7, would you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you but you should rule over it." Remember, we made a comparison between this and the curse of Eve. And what a powerful imagery that here is sin crouching at the door. You can almost see like a lion or a tiger just waiting for you to open that door and come out, and it's just going to pounce on you. And that's kind of the way sin is. But God just seems to be saying to Cain that it's there in that crouching position because of your attitude, that we can maybe ward off sin and temptation if we have a better attitude about it. But when you think about it, most of your bad decisions are made when you're upset about something, or you're in a weak state of mind, and so God warns him. Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose against Abel and his brother and killed him. All right, question. And again, I like to be fair. I tell you up front, it's a trick question. And so pause and think about it a little bit. What did Cain use? What was the murder weapon? We're going to play CSI Garden of Eden here, or not post Garden of Eden, I guess. And so what was the murder weapon? Let me ask you this. What is it usually thought of? We talked about the fruit being an apple in kind of literature and paintings and all. And we usually see the weapon being maybe a knife, but many times as a rock. In fact, there's been a few memes on Facebook through the years of the idea of usually pro or anti-gun control arguments that, the rock, it wasn't the rock that killed, kind of like where that argument is going to go. Yeah, yeah. We're just simply not told. Just like we're not told what kind of fruit that was that they ate, we're just simply not. It just says he killed him. Do what? Yeah, whatever it was, it drew blood. Yeah, so it may have been some kind of fashioned knife, some kind of, sharp bone fragment or something. We just really don't know. And it really doesn't matter. Dead is dead. And so he kills him. And then do we see a parallel here? And I'm not saying this is the second sin. Uh, there may have been other sins, but most likely were. You don't go that long without sinning because it's been at least 18 months, hasn't it? We're assuming these aren't, in the text, that these aren't twins, and so we're at least 18 months removed from that first sin, probably far more than that. But this is the second sin that's recorded in Scripture, and we see some similarities in how God approaches Cain, don't we? Remember when he approached his mom and dad, he says, "Where are you? And who told you that you were naked?" And ask those probing questions. And he does the same thing to Cain here. Where is Abel, your brother? And again, that's not God saying, "I don't know where he's at. You've hidden him." It's God giving Cain the opportunity to fess up for himself. And he says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" And kind of that language there, keeper, is kind of like an animal. You're a keeper of an animal. Am I the shepherd who's supposed to take care of these animals? Um, and then, of course, God reveals that he knew the truth all along. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." What poetry, what literature there. The blood's crying out from the ground. Crying out for what? Justice, most likely. Maybe anger, but certainly justice is crying out, and God is going to answer that cry.
It's interesting. It said the life of the flesh is in the blood. And that's why we're not supposed to, this in Genesis, I don't know if we've covered it yet, but they're not supposed to eat meat with the blood in it.
Yeah.
Because it's the life, the blood has the life in it. And when the blood goes out, the life leaves. And it's like the blood kind of carries the life of the creature, and the blood goes out. And so it kind of goes with what he says. Your blood cries out to me from the ground. So his blood is spilling out. It's like his life is ebbing out.
Yeah.
And
That loss of life, or life itself, is crying out in a way to God for most likely justice. And so you are cursed, he's going to say in verse 11, from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. We're going to find out more when we get to Genesis chapter 9, when Noah and his family exit the ark, and God gives them permission, maybe for the first time recorded time at least, to be able to kill and to shed the blood of animals and to eat them. But he makes a distinction, but your fellow man, you cannot shed his blood, or your life would be required for that life. And so we'll talk a lot about it then, but God makes that distinction between animals and humans, and the killing of animals and the killing of humans. That despite what some of our liberal friends might say, they're not the same. Now, let me add this little asterisk here. God has given us, and I think that still is in effect, regardless of the curse and being cast out of the garden, God's given man dominion over the earth. And I think with that comes some responsibility. God doesn't want us to just trash this planet and treat it cruelly, but He's also given us those animals for food, that we have dominion over them and can take their life, but not the life of a fellow man. And we'll talk about that again and why that. But anyway, you're cursed. So a lot of similarities between that first sin and this second recorded sin, isn't there? The probing questions, and now the curse. Adam and Eve were cursed because of their sin. Now Cain is going to be cursed from that. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. Now, I take this to be a ramping up from you think, well, wait a minute, that's already happened. That was Adam's curse, and that's going to be passed along to every generation. But it seems to me that this is an intensification of that, and maybe I would argue that Adam's curse was universal, that is, it's passed down, but this seemed to be maybe more specific to Cain. This is going to be Cain's curse rather than Cain's descendants inheriting that part of the curse. Again, I can't be dogmatic about that, but the ground is going to be cursed. Is that just an arbitrary curse, or is that because of the blood is in the ground and kind of is attached to that? You have defiled the ground with your brother's blood, and so now the ground is angry at you and is going to fight against you as a part of this curse. Adam?
Punishment fitting the crime thing, if that goes back to Cain's attitude with the sacrifice, perhaps, and he might have been very proud of his grain or whatever, whether he offered God's best or not. He might have had a different pride of, look what I have got here and I am going to show off here, as opposed to Abel might have had the more humble attitude about
Mm.
what Cain was overly prideful about his grain offering, then this would be a particularly poignant curse for him, punishment for him, which is, why we get into what he says later here as far as, yeah. I won't, you probably have a point.
Yeah. No, no, that's a very good point. And it is a pointed curse to Cain because he was a farmer. If he was a city fella, you think, well, I don't care. The ground's gonna. I don't even mow my own grass. I don't care about that. But here's somebody who was a tiller of the ground, and now the ground is going to fight. It's very much a personal curse. And to your point too, if we were preaching a sermon here, we would talk about how really the source of sin, it started with that attitude that's kind of borne out in what we see in Cain. And then also another lesson in a sermon would be kind of the idea of what should our attitude be when we are reprimanded. I think there's a part of some of us, maybe a lot of us, that when you're reprimanded, you kind of just want to bow up and say, "Who are you to tell me what to?" I no, the right attitude would have been, in fact, try to make a hypothetical scenario. What if Cain, had done the right thing, offered the wrong sacrifice? We leave that part of the story there. But when God says, "I accept yours," and then if Cain's saying, "Oh, I'm sorry," can you explain it to me again? I'll do better next time. And maybe even turn to his brother and say, "Abel, can you help me? You did it right. Can I copy off of your paper? I want to please God, and so can you help me?" And you think about what a different scenario that would be, and I think there's some lessons, some sermony lessons in there. Adam, again.
Still what we see in humanity. Okay, here, I tried, and the boss, the teacher, the whatever says, you need to do a little better. There's two reactions. It's either, oh, okay, well, where can I improve? What can I work harder at? Or, well, fine, I'm done.
Yeah,
Tried, I'm done.
yeah,
Kind of think how Cain did it too. I don't think there was any, how can I do it better? It was, I did it good, and it's your problem, not mine.
and how we become so irrational in our reactions. What did Abel do? You can have to be delicate in how I say that. Cain getting angry at God because God's the one who rejected it, but he gets angry at Abel. Abel didn't say your sacrifice stinks. Get out of here. Wasn't Abel didn't do anything to you at all. And so how we can be irrational sometimes in our reactions to those things. Another curse is you're going to be a fugitive and a vagabond. Again, the parallel between that first sin. They were cast out of the garden. They're to be outsiders away from the fellowship of God and the blessings of God, that garden. And now the same thing happens, or a similar thing happens to Cain. You got to go. And so that's always has been kind of a pattern of punishment for sin, is that we're separated from God, separated from our brethren. And so that pattern is established here. Cain has the audacity to say, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you've driven me out this day from the face of the ground. I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. And it will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me." You put a target on my back, God. Everybody's going to know I'm the one who killed my brother. Again, we're not real pleased with Cain's attitude here. Instead of just saying, as David would when he's confronted with his sin and the punishment, he accepts that I have sinned. But now Cain's going, well, that's a little too harsh and there. But the Lord says to Cain, "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold." And so the idea of a vigilante attitude is forbidden by God. And God put a mark on Cain, lest anyone finding him should kill him. All right. Second trick question of the night: what was this mark? Yeah, the mark of the beast on his forehead, wasn't it? We hear ridiculous things. You want to hear, and you may have heard this one, the most ridiculous one that I've ever heard, and maybe this was just spouted in Alabama because of some of our history there, that this is the origin of black people, that Cain was cursed and God turned him black. And so now all the blacks are bad people because they descend from Cain. Well, there's one or a couple, but one big problem with that is number one, there's no indication that this mark was transferable to the next generation. And even if it was, Cain's generation dies out in the flood. And so even if that mark, let's say it was something on the forehead that said, "Don't kill me," and it did pass to his generation. That's been wiped out because again, Cain's descendants died in the flood, and so whatever that mark was, either died with Cain, most likely that's what happened, or it died with his descendants in the flood. If it was transferred, again, there's no indication that it was. Yes, Mark.
My Bible was appointed in signs of, and gosh, I get some more wrong messed up. Not some kind of mark or on Cain, but a sign to reassure him of God's gracious protection in his life.
Yeah. And so this is an illustration of in the midst of punishment and anger, God's obviously angry at Cain, that there's mercy that you're not going to be killed. And I'm going to protect you, even though maybe you don't deserve it. Max?
Prime examples. There's got to be more to the story than what's written here. Why, one of his big fears here is getting killed by somebody else. Well, we got Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve. Who else is there? We don't know.
Yeah. So we assume, don't we? And I think this is pretty safe that some time has transpired here, and Adam and Eve have been busy, and we have a lot of children. That kind of comes up in verse 17, doesn't it? And it's the old eternal unanswerable question. Where did Cain got married? Well, then who did he marry? Well, as far as I know, there's only two options. He married either his sister or a niece, or maybe a great niece. That's something in that. And as much as we cringe at that concept today, that wasn't completely unknown in biblical times, the idea of marrying a close family relative there. So see, Alabama is very biblical in that. No, forget I said that. So anyway, now we have this family of Cain. I don't know if I've got that there. Yeah, we're back to the family of Cain that's listed here, and we're not going to go through. I could be cruel and call on people to read here because we've got a lot of difficult names to pronounce. A couple of things we will highlight. Verse 19: Lamech took for himself two wives. Now we don't know what that language exactly is intended. This is for himself. Is that just means he took two wives to marry him, or does that mean kind of he did this on his own? It was his own idea to take multiple wives. Whether that's what the language is saying, we maybe can assume that was, he kind of made up that concept. We have the origin of some different trades in verse 20. Jabal was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. The father just means he was the first. He's the kind of the prototype, the first to do it, and then others would follow after him. Not necessarily his children, maybe that, but even others would learn that practice. Jubal in verse 21 was the father of those who play the harp and the flute. And again, father just means he was the first. And so others, either whether his descendants or others, would have taken that up. Zillah was an instructor, or excuse me, Tubal Cain, the son of Zillah, instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Um, Now, one thing we learn about this is, despite, again, what some might believe, is that this evolutionary thought that ancient man was just like a caveman, just grunted and scared by fire, and didn't know how to do anything but club animals and their wife and drag them back into the cave. That's just simply, these people were very sophisticated. They were playing very early on, uh, tending to crops, tending to animals, playing instruments, fashioning things with metal, very, very early on. Uh, Verse 25, we kind of turn the page here. Adam knew his wife again and bore a son named Seth. Again, as Mac, I think as Mac pointed out, there's a lot we're not told here. There's It'd be an incorrect assumption to think that Seth was the third and the last child. That just simply doesn't add up. What we are doing here is we're going back in time, though, because starting with verse 16 through 24, we do Cain's genealogy. That's not to say that after all these descendants of Cain had been born, then Adam and Eve had Seth. Now, that may be possible. They lived 900 years, could have been, but that's not necessarily a sequential chronological story that's going here. Just because verse 25 comes after verse 24 in the text doesn't necessarily mean it happened after it on the timeline. That makes sense? Because much of the biblical history is kind of grouped together, kind of in categories or in people. And so that we have Seth that was born. To him was born Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord. Does that mean they hadn't before? Or maybe that they had been a gap where they did not? We're just, again, not really sure about that. Real quickly, we can get through chapter 5 because, again, we're not going to go through all of those names. We have the history of Adam. And we stop and we ask, why is chapter 5 in there? It's just a long genealogy. It's one of those things where, if we're honest, this is confession time. Have you ever done those read the Bible in a year things? Did you maybe just kind of skip chapter 5 in your Bible reading, or skim over it a little bit? It may be because of all these difficult to pronounce names. I'll offer a couple speculations. That's all I can do. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Seth means the appointed one. So he is kind of pretty important, the way I understand it. And then it goes on to the genealogy, just like you said.
Yeah, because Seth is going to be that one through whom the generations go to Noah and then to Christ. Because so yeah, there is some significance in that name. Absolutely, good point. So if we're speculating, why do we have this genealogy here? Larry's going to tell us. Larry.
Moses wrote the book. His audience originally was the Israelites. They all descended, from this, and they loved their genealogies.
Oh, yeah.
That was clear up into the New Testament times. They were worried about what tribe they were from, and then they could trace their family and all that. But like everyone extant then would have descended through Seth. That's what gave rise to them, because all the other kids that Adam and Eve may have had, there may have been 300 of them, but they all died in the flood along with all their descendants. So,
Yeah, yeah. And so this is the genealogy. So there's part of that, just the value of a genealogy that gets us to, most importantly, to Christ, but to the Jewish people. And a shortcutted version of it is it's just a fast forwarding to Noah. He's the last one on the list here, and so we're not going to tell the story about everybody, but we do want to tell the story of Noah. So just to kind of speed us along, this one had a baby, this one had a baby, and then there was Noah. All right, now let's slow down and we'll talk about Noah. So it's just a fast way to get us to Noah, is one way of looking at it. One is, again, the value of the genealogy that gets us to Noah, but certainly more importantly gets us to Christ, gets us to the Jewish nation. But then here's another. How does every one of these genealogical listings end? There's a 3-word phrase that ends every generation. And he died. That kind of attaches us to the sin problem, doesn't it? That wasn't going to happen until chapter 3 happened, an entrance of sin. And so maybe there's that little reminder. This is what sin does. And he dies. Everybody's dying now because of this. There are 10 generations listed in chapter 5, 8 between Adam and Noah. So if we count Adam and Noah, there's 10, but there's 8 in between them. A couple things about that. There's no reason to assume that this is an exhaustive list. We know from other lists, genealogy lists in the Bible, that sometimes generations are skipped. You just weren't important enough to make the list. That happens even in Jesus' genealogy when we get to the New Testament. There's generations that are just skipped there. And so there may have been more than 10 generations in between Adam and Noah. These are the 10 that are listed because of maybe of their significance. Again, we talked about the age issue that was there. A couple of names jump out to us on this list. Enoch. Enoch's one of the 2 men in the Old Testament that do not die. He was taken. And then, of course, Methuselah jumps out to us. Everybody knows that trivia question, the oldest man that ever lived. A couple things about that is, yeah, he gets the record, again, that's recorded. There may have somebody that lived older than him that didn't make the list, is a possibility. And not to diminish his Guinness Book of World Record entry here, but he didn't outlive some of these by a long shot. It's not like he lived 969 and everybody else died when they were 100. Others were 900 and even some 960. So, so don't, yeah, we recognize him, but it's not like he lived so much longer than others. Max?
So, I don't know if they're right or not, but I've read several times that Methuselah died in the year of the flood. So he might not have died, he might have drowned.
Yeah, or died by drowning. Yes, if our calculations are correct, and they have to put that if in there, that you add it up, he did die the year of the flood. So it is possible that he died in the flood, but also possible he died before that flood. He was 969 after all, so probably didn't take much. Maybe just seeing the thunder and the lightning scared him, and he died of a heart attack. So yeah, now Melchizedek is later. He's not even alive yet.
I just need to go back to bed.
You'll think of it. You'll think of it. Here's a little riddle, not really a riddle for you, but you know the answer. Who's the oldest man who ever lived, but he died before his father did? You know, we know how that's possible, but that's just kind of strange. How can you be the oldest person who ever lived, but you died before your father? Well, of course, Methuselah's the oldest person who ever lived, and Enoch didn't die. And so a little bit of, again, another trick question there. So, all right. So that gets us to Noah and his 3 sons, Ham, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Of course, real quickly, because I may forget to say this later, Shem is going to be the one through whom the Jewish people find their heritage. And it's a possibility, that's all I can say, is a possibility that sometimes descendants and even whole countries are named after their forefather. And so it's possible that one of the titles to the Israelites, or those who would become Israelites, is that they were Shemites. And that's very close to Semite. We talk about the Semitic people and being the Jewish people. And so we don't really know where that term comes from. We don't know where Hebrew comes from. We know where Israelites come from, but it makes sense to me that Shemites eventually become Semites, and that's maybe one of the terms for this race of people. So we'll pick up there with one of the most famous stories in the book of Genesis next time.